Let's talk about CCA Christensen, one of Mormonism's most influential painters. Now, scholars will often argue that Latter-day Saints in particular, but most religions in general, learn their theology and their history and their culture through the visual arts as much as the textual and oral arts. And few people have been as influential on the Mormon tradition in the visual world as CCA Christensen, a 19th century Danish convert who became the most successful, most prolific, and most influential Mormon painter of that century before being mostly forgotten. You're probably familiar with some of his art, like his famous Delivering the Baby, which appeared on the cover of Laurel Ulrich's book on A House Full of Females. You're probably familiar with his artistic renditions of the persecution of the Mormons in Missouri, like this one when they were kicked out of Jackson County. Or you might be familiar with the murals that he painted for the St. George and the Manti Temple. Here is a mural in the Manti Temple, for instance. Sadly, he's largely been forgotten in recent decades, though that's starting to change, and his influence is mostly overlooked. Fortunately for us, we have a new book that is resurrecting him, so to speak, in the Mormon consciousness. The wonderful artistic scholar Jenny Champoux published CCA Christensen, a Mormon Visionary, as part of the University of Illinois Press's Short Introductions to Mormon Thought series. I just did another volume from this series on Richard Bushman just a few weeks ago. So in this video, I want to introduce Christensen and this book about him. I will then interview the author, Jenny Champoux, who was kind enough to answer my questions about the book and its topic. And then I'll provide some analysis about why I found this book so useful and why I recommend it to others. So let's dig in. CCA Christensen was born in Scandinavia in 1831. He was raised in a poor family that struggled so much, in fact, that when they could no longer provide for all their children, he was sent off to a poor house's boarding school. But his artistic talent shone through, and soon he got a patron and he was sent to the Danish Royal School of Art, where he studied alongside other influential painters like Carl Bloch, whose depictions of the life of Christ are well known in the LDS sphere and would actually be a big influence on Christensen's own work. He, unlike the other artists, converts to Mormonism in 1850 as a wave of Mormon missionaries come through. He serves as a missionary in his home nation a few times, but faces substantial persecution. Even though Denmark was supposed to have a religious toleration, he did not feel it as much. And that sense of persecution is going to shape his life and much of his work. He eventually migrates to Utah in 1857. He becomes a polygamist, being sealed to 3 women. He takes a number of odd jobs to provide for his 3 households, but he always wanted to use his artistic tools. He was the first highly trained artist in the Mormon tradition, and he reached success with this, especially in 2 panorama projects in the 1970s or the 1870s. One known as the Huntington Panorama. It's also known as Untitled. It was rediscovered in recent decades. He painted these multiple murals to teach indigenous converts the history of the world, including Bible, Book of Mormon stories, and the church. You're probably familiar with some of his artistic depictions of Adam and Eve, or Jesus Christ, or the Book of Mormon that come from this series. He then also painted the Mormon Panorama, a fear that this growing generation of saints in the 1870s were unfamiliar with what took place before the saints moved west, especially as many of those first generation were passing away. So he did this road show where he would show these massive paintings of the church and its historical moments to teach that history. And it's in those paintings that we really see the Mormon persecution complex come into full bloom, an emphasis on how the Mormons were despised, this moment of exceptionalism, especially as Christensen himself is facing persecution as the government is trying to prosecute polygamists, and he eventually will be tried, and a year-long trial. He is sent to Denmark on a mission to try to avoid. He is eventually found guilty, or found innocent. But it's a whole ordeal. And throughout that and his many other paintings, here's another painting of the saints leaving Nauvoo, with which you're probably familiar. He really shapes the Mormon consciousness. This is how Champoux puts it in the book. Quote, "By the end of the 19th century, CCA Christensen was among the most famous living illustrators of Latter-day Saint belief and experience. Not only was Christensen well known, but he was influential in shaping Mormon thought with his art and writing. His paintings helped form a sense of cohesive Latter-day Saint identity. He was, as a few examples in the book, the first to really depict Book of Mormon characters, so how they visualize what took place in their founding scripture. He taught history to a whole new generation, and he established a type of artistic tradition that largely remained in place for a long time." Now, in this book, because it's part of the University of Illinois Press series, it's very structured. There's a biographical chapter, and then there's 3 thematic chapters. She has one on wilderness and forests in his work. She has one on the Book of Mormon depictions and how she visualizes scripture. And then she has one on Christensen's vision of Zion and how it evolved over the years, first from seeing Mormons as a people set apart, then seeing Mormons as broadly American, especially as they start assimilation. And then, fascinatingly, as the church becomes more assimilated in American culture, he turns to a nostalgic depiction of the Scandinavian culture that he fears they are losing. That's enough of the background. Let's move on to interview the author herself. Before I get to the author, though, just a reminder that if you enjoy this kind of nerdy historical content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I try to do deep dives on particular topics every Monday. I talk about current events, politics, media, movies, recent polls on Wednesday. And then on Friday, I pull back the craft of the scholar to talk with authors like in this video, to highlight new work, to dig up classic works, to look at the sources behind historiographical arguments so that you too can think like a scholar. If you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many people who have chosen to give back, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name when you leave comments, but most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing, rigorous scholarship and allow both me and my producer, Anthony, to justify the time in making these videos. I also recommend subscribing to my various social media platforms, especially Instagram, where I provide supplemental information, and you can also subscribe to my free kit newsletter, where I send out infrequent notices of announcements and news and links and announcements and all those fun things. But that's enough about me. Let's get back to Champoux and Christensen. Jenny Champoux is one of the best artistic scholars of dissecting these visual representations of the Mormon culture that we've had in recent years. She's also a delightful human being. She's the director of the Book of Mormon art catalog, a phenomenal resource. She's the co-author of the book Picturing Christ, Understanding Depictions of Jesus in History and Art, and she's also the co-editor of Approaching the Tree, Interpreting 1 Nephi 8, to show her broad range of intellectual skills. I was very happy that she agreed to join me and talk about this book and provide some answers to questions that I had, and I hope that you might have as well. And we are now pleased to be joined by Jenny Champoux, the author of this new book on CCA Christensen. I'm so glad to have you here to answer some of my questions and to unpack this fascinating figure. So let's start out with a general portrait of the man. CCA Christensen is such a quixotic person with a varied career, interesting personality. He was a poet, he was a politician, he was a writer, a farmer, and he produced so many different genres: poetry, these diaries, these historical works, and painting. So how did you come around to understand Christensen as a human being, and how do you see him as a person?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I definitely feel like we see some shifts over time in his approach to the gospel and how he was choosing to live his beliefs. So early in his life, in his journals and letters and his poems, we see a lot of this sort of expectation that the end of the world is about to happen, right? And we've got to get to Utah and build Zion before it's the end of the world. And he really shapes his life choices around that feeling. But then, as the years go by, and the end of the world doesn't come, and he gets old, and he has children that grow up, and his friends start to pass away, he starts feeling more of this sense of needing to build something that will last. And so he really does a lot of history, especially with the Scandinavian saints in Utah. He's really meticulous in recording his own history. And then, of course, his art, like the Mormon Panorama, is this visual record of the persecution of the early saints as they moved westward across America. And so in all these ways, he's sort of building a history and a foundation for something that will last.
Yeah, I loved your argument in the book that his focus on persecution not only shaped a generation of how Latter-day Saints viewed their history and, built this kind of persecution complex that many Latter-day Saints have, but it was born out of his personal experience, that he was persecuted as a missionary in Norway. He was tried for cohabitation as a polygamist in the 1880s. That was not something that he's projecting or like faking. That is something that was deeply rooted in his persona.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really important context to keep in mind as we look at his images that are thinking about moments that happened, sometimes 50 years earlier. But he has this perspective of like a later 19th century saint who's dealt with persecution on his missions and being arrested for unlawful cohabitation. And so I think all of that plays into how he's thinking about these earlier moments of church history.
Yeah. So you make the provocative, and I think in the end persuasive argument that Christensen did a lot to shape Mormon thought, theology, and culture with his paintings. How does he do that? Because we typically don't think of these artists as being so influential. I'm a historian, so of course I focus on the word and text. But why are these artistic renditions so crucial in understanding how Latter-day Saints viewed Scripture and the world and themselves?
Yeah, great question. He is one of the earliest people to visualize Latter-day Saint scripture or doctrine or history. And so he doesn't really have a canon to draw from like artists today might. And so he's having to be creative sometimes. And he's also pulling from what he's learned in his European art training. And that's a really interesting mix of this European fine arts symbolism and style, but then bringing it to this Latter-day Saint context in Utah. I think about in 1890, he was the artist for the Deseret Sunday School Union's little picture chart that they did on the life of Nephi. So he had 10 images in there that he painted, and then they turned them into lithographs. And the Deseret Sunday School Union distributed these for free to all the Sunday schools that existed at the time. And so his images are widely distributed and used to teach both children and adults. And so for many members of the church in the 19th century and even into the first couple decades of the 20th century, these are the only images or some of the only images that they're seeing of the Book of Mormon. And so I think they have this really profound impact on how we think about what these characters or scenes looked like, but also how religious art functions, right? And go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, visualizing the narratives that they're seeing in the scripture, right? Actually putting, at least textual flesh or painting flesh on those bones.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I like that.
So as a historian, I have often used Christensen's paintings as just showing how the Latter-day Saints, understood history. And this is like so many of the paintings of the Mormon Panorama focused on the Missouri persecutions. And this is and you cover that, but you also go into the method of painting. Why do you think his artistic skill is as important to know as just the content that he's presenting?
Sure. Yeah. And I think this is something that hasn't been done a lot before, really doing a kind of art historical analysis of looking at how Christensen's using style and the composition and the formal elements like line and shape and color and space, and how all of that contributes to a meaning that he's hoping viewers will read in the painting. So, and again, I want to situate Christensen not just as a Mormon artist, but as an American artist of the 19th century, and also in this European art context of the time too. He not only was trained at the Danish Royal Academy of Fine Arts, but he had 3 missions in Scandinavia over the course. Like his last one, he came home, I think, in 1888, and so he's not removed from that context. He's still going there, and in his journals, he talks about going to exhibitions, going to museums, taking additional painting classes even while he's on his missions there. And so he's very much still involved in what's happening in Danish art and Scandinavian art. And one of the things that I found that was so fun was in one of his journals of his 3rd mission. In 1888, he wrote that he went to Frederiksborg Castle and saw the brand new series of The Life of Christ by Karl Bloch. And of course, today we see these Bloch images all the time in our church materials, right? And Bloch and Christensen had actually been classmates earlier in the Royal Academy. They'd been in a class together. And then after Christensen sees that Bloch series, he comes home and immediately starts working on this Life of Nephi series for the 1890 picture chart. And I see so many influences of Bloch and this change in style from Christensen's earlier work. So that's just a great example of how he's still very engaged in what's happening and bringing that to LDS art.
Yeah, especially in shaping how Mormons view art as very much a figurative representation rather than just an abstract ideal, right?
Right. That's right. Yeah, he's very interested in making it detailed, realistic. He talked to witnesses of these moments. He would read newspaper articles, and he wanted it to really feel authentic, almost like a snapshot, like a photograph of like, this is how it really happened. Of course, it's not how it really happened. It's not a photograph. And most of these scenes, Christensen didn't witness himself. But he wants it to look that way, to be this authoritative image of how history really happened.
So you show how Christensen was really the first professional and skilled artist in Mormonism, and by far the most influential, or at least most prolific, in the 19th century. And while many people will probably be familiar with several of those paintings, you also note how there has been a decline in his use in the 20th century. I think you said only 2 of his images show up in the Come Follow Me material.
Yeah.
So why did he go from such a crucial artist to someone who's largely forgotten?
Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating story. I think part of it is that a lot of his paintings, both large and small, were passed down to descendants or friends or descendants of friends. And so a lot of the paintings existed in people's attics or just, on the wall of a home in Ephraim, Utah, and just gets passed down through the generations. And it really was only in the early 80s that some of the curators at the Church History Museum started to try to catalog these things and collect what might be there, or at least catalog them. But I think another important point here is that he does have this kind of folksy style, right? He didn't complete his training at the Royal Academy of Fine Art because he joined the church and then he was like all in on the church. So he didn't finish his art training. He has some skill, but compared to Karl Bloch, like, the anatomy of the figures isn't always quite right. It's it's a little bit naive. And I think when we get to like the mid 20th century and the church's correlation efforts, that's not the style that they want to promote as like the kind of official images of the church, right? And then they turn to people like Arnold Freeberg, who do these
very masculine.
Yeah, right. And so Christensen, drawing on his Danish heritage, was really interested in showing the common man in his art, right?
Yeah.
But then, like, Arnold Freeberg wants to show this like mythic hero, and so Christensen's art just doesn't work as well for the church's needs at that time.
Yeah, one of my favorite pins that the Mormon R put together for MHA a few years ago was Arnold Freeberg's gym, and it's like that's the text that replaced Gold's gym.
Yeah.
And a shout out to Kate Davis in a recent issue of Dialogue has a great article on Arnold Freeberg and the masculine image and the homoerotic type of anxieties behind a lot of that, and that's fascinating. One of the great examples you give of this forgotten nature is when there was this public outcry over the Manti Temple being changed and the removal of the Minerva Teichert paintings, but there wasn't as much of a clamor for the CCA Christensen murals that were in the same temple, which I think was a great way to demonstrate this shift. Another thing that Christensen and Teichert have in common, of course, are their depictions of Native Americans. Yeah. And in your final chapter, you detail this fascinating timeline to where Christensen's painting goes from trying to prove Mormon distinctiveness, this exceptional identity, to proving their Americanness, and then later on in life trying to demonstrate this nostalgia for Danish art. But in that middle section, one of the ways that he proved the Americanness of the Mormons was to juxtapose them to Native Americans. So as someone who appreciates Christensen's art, as someone who's trying to flesh out the human story, how do you reckon with the very problematic nature, this anti-Native American racism that's found in this art, like many art of the era? How do we situate that within his broader corpus?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember he is perpetuating stereotypes. He's not inventing these stereotypes, but these are tropes that exist in visual art in America and in Europe, thinking about like French Orientalism and the way both American and European artists were applying that, right? So French Orientalism initially was looking at sort of Bible land areas in the Middle East and trying to get at an authentic history of what Bible lands would have looked like, but they're using 19th century costuming and artifacts and thinking, oh, this must be how it looked to portray Bible scenes, which of course is not accurate. But it's presented in this sort of authentic way. And then a lot of them start looking at American Native people and doing the same thing of this kind of romanticizing, right? They're either idealized or they're presented as very savage, but it's always this contrast between East and West, right? It's sort of this moralizing meaning underneath it all that, right, the West is rational and civilized, and the East is more sensual and savage, right? Or even violent. And so we see those same tropes show up in Christensen's art of Native Americans. I do think there's an earlier moment where he does a panel of images to be used for missionary efforts with the Ute and Goshute and Paiute people. And so there's this interesting early moment where they really feel this like brotherhood with the local people because they see them as the modern day descendants of the Lamanites and that they're part of this whole redemption story that the Mormons are building. But then later you see Christensen in his art showing or like turning more to these tropes of like savagery, showing Indians scalping someone, right, or looking more violent. Christensen did in his journals, he did witness scenes like this. He wrote about a time he came across a settler in the road who had been shot with arrows and stripped of his clothes, and so he it's interesting. He was living through these years of the Black Hawk War when he was in Ephraim and Mount Pleasant. So he did have some, actual, encounters with Native Americans, not all of which were pleasant for him. But yeah, and then later you see this sort of political context of thinking about the Latter-day Saints trying to assimilate in America, and then in Christensen's art you see more of the Latter-day Saints as being shown in contraposition to the Native Americans to show that they're more like the Americans back east. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good answer. And that's like choosing what to represent, of course, is always politically charged. It comes with baggage. It perpetuates these stereotypes that do real harm to peoples. And I'm glad you're able to highlight in his work. All right. So let's finish on a bit of a positive note. Why don't you talk about your favorite CCA Christensen painting? If you could pick one, and I know that that's difficult, pick a painting and explain to me why you appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I appreciate that caveat, because it's like you can't pick a favorite child, and I couldn't pick a favorite painting either. But I'll just pick one. And this is one that he did in 1903. It's called Missionaries Preaching in Denmark. So this is one of his last paintings that he does at the end of his life. And it's this moment where he's really feeling nostalgic about his childhood in Scandinavia, and he's teaching Danish at the San Pete Academy. He's writing his history and publishing it in local magazines, and then he starts painting a bunch of Scandinavian scenes, and these are from memory because he hasn't been there in years at this point. And he's remembering earlier moments, and this is such a sweet little scene of two Mormon missionaries knocking on a door on a little rural scene in Denmark. And we see a woman opening the door and coming out to talk with the missionaries, and little rose bushes around her. And then on her roof is a nest of storks. And this is a famous symbol in Denmark of good luck. And if you had storks nesting on your roof, that was like a really auspicious sign that like good things were coming to you. And so I like that he draws on that Danish symbolism for this kind of Mormon moment there, maybe thinking about his own missionary experiences. And can I tell one quick story?
Please go for it. Yeah.
This little painting, nobody had seen it in person in years, and I really wanted to include it in the book because I think it's just says a lot about his psychology at the end of his life. And when I went to try to get image permissions from it, it looked like it was in the Church History Museum. And turns out it's not in their collection, but it's in a private collection of one of his descendants through his second wife, Marin. So one of Marin's descendants, and they actually didn't realize that that the museum wasn't currently showing it, that they had loaned it to the museum decades ago for an exhibition, and the museum still had it. And I don't know, something had gotten lost in translation, but I was able to, through some sleuthing on Family Search, I was able to find this descendant and connect her with the Church History Museum curator and get that painting returned to the family. And they were thrilled and very lovely and excited about the project. So that was a really nice, like, personal moment.
Great. That's fantastic to hear. So thank you again, Jenny, for speaking with me. And thanks even more so for producing such a great book to introduce us to Christensen and his work.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks again to Jenny Champoux for the wonderful and incisive discussion. I certainly learned a lot. I hope you learned a lot as well. I loved this volume. Again, it's titled CCA Christensen, Mormon Visionary, published with the University of Illinois Press. I'll have a link to it in the video description. I was only moderately aware of Christensen. I was, of course, aware with some of his paintings, particularly their use in framing Mormon persecution narratives. I was totally ignorant of the artistic influences as well as the artistic impact. And so I found this book. It's very quick. It's only 100 pages to read. I read it in one sitting, and I was blown away by the depth that she was able to cover in it. Some of the key themes I enjoyed. I previously highlighted the evolution of Christensen's art from exceptionalism to Americanism to cultural distinctive nostalgia, her use of viewing wilderness as a dual threat and potential in the paintings, as it's either something that can bring new possibilities or it's perceived as a threat. Her reckoning with Christensen's use of race, I thought, was particularly poignant and useful in today's day of recognizing the beauty of this work, but also the racist stereotypes that can be perpetuated that we need to understand and wrestle with. His turn to Danish culture in his later years, he spoke about this in his famous painting that I enjoyed, and I also enjoyed her explanations of why he is no longer as relevant as he was before. In general, I love the volume. It's worth reading. I recommend checking it out. I hope you found this video useful. I really hope that you'll use this as a platform to go read the scholarship that I'm talking about. History has never been more relevant than it is today, and Christensen's own work is a testament to that, which is why I'm glad we now have this book to tell us why.